But another major theme of her reporting over the years has been the plight of higher education. And it's the crisis of the campus and its effects on the broader culture and society that is the focus of her brand new book, The Diversity Delusion, just out from St. Martin's, and it's the focus of her talk today as well. Thickly reported, like all of her work, The Diversity Delusion shows that the university obsession with racial and gender diversity is helping no one. Indeed, it's creating a generation of purported victims who will bring their pathologies into the workplace. It's squandering enormous amounts of money, and it's destroying the great Western ideal of a humanistic education and replacing it with a gray ideology and thought control. It's a book that couldn't be more timely and is already generating massive media attention. George Will has devoted 2 of his Washington Post columns to it over the last week, and Heather's been doing nonstop TV and radio for the last 10 days. She's written frequently for the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Post, National Review, the New Criterion, and many, many other outlets. She's also written several other books, including The Burden of Bad Ideas. She holds degrees from Yale, Cambridge, and Stanford. So with all that, and there's so much more, let me turn things over to Heather MacDonald.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, for that extraordinary, generous introduction. It's been my great honor to write for City Journal under both you and Myron Magnet, and I could not have done what I've done without your insights and support. And thank you, Larry, as well. And thank you for coming today. This is a different experience. I've been speaking on college campuses recently. So you know what that means. I've received the walkout, the storm the stage strategy, and at Claremont McKenna in Southern California, the blockade that prevented anyone from actually attending my talk. So-called students of color at nearby Pomona College announced that I was a, quote, fascist, white supremacist, war hawk, transphobe, queerphobe, classist, and ignorant of interlocking systems of domination that produce the lethal conditions under which oppressed people are forced to live. End quote. So to actually have an audience still in its seats and apparently willing to listen is an unusual experience that may take me a while to get accustomed to. Now, we've been hearing a lot of late about the crisis of free speech on college campuses, but not much about its root cause. The narcissistic victimology that is rapidly spreading from academia to the rest of culture. In a word, the American university is in the grips of a mass hysteria. Students actually believe that they are victims of oppression at risk of their lives from circumambient racism and sexism. The degree of maudlin caterwauling is impossible to overstate. At Brown, students of color occupied the president's office and complained about having to meet such academic expectations as attending class when they were so focused on, quote, staying alive at Brown. At Yale, a mob of minority students surrounded a highly respected sociologist and cursed and screamed at him for 3 hours because his wife had sent an email suggesting that students could choose their own Halloween costumes free from the ministrations of Yale's diversity bureaucracy. Among the shouts of, "Shut the F up," and I'm censoring that, and "You are disgusting," that were directed at this mild-mannered left-wing professor was a cry of, "We're dying," from one of the ranters referring to the allegedly endangered status of Yale's minority students. But my favorite moment in this parade of narcissism came from Princeton. In 2015, Princeton's black students chanted, "We're sick and tired of being sick and tired." Now, this phrase was first used by Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights activist who was beaten in the 1950s for trying to vote. Fannie Lou Hamer had grounds aplenty for being sick and tired of being sick and tired. But any Princeton student, I don't care if he's green, purple, or orange, who thinks of himself as oppressed is in the grip of a terrible delusion that will encumber him for the rest of his life. Well, perhaps you're thinking, at least the adults on campus are trying to give students a firmer grip on reality. To the contrary, the adults actively encourage the hysteria. A massive diversity bureaucracy is devoted to cultivating in students ever more arcane species of self-involvement and ever more preposterous forms of self-pity. Do you want to know the reason for astronomical tuition? Look no further than this bureaucratic bloat. Students regularly act out little psychodramas of oppression before an appreciative audience of diversity deanlets, vice provosts of equity, diversity, and inclusion, who use the occasion to expand their dominion. Many campuses have created bias response teams, modeled presumably on active shooter response teams on the assumption that discrimination is so rampant and lethal that a rapid defense force is needed. Freshman orientations and dorm sessions invariably feature seminars in toxic masculinity and white privilege. Students are taught that they are either the oppressed or the oppressors. If you are not female, black, Hispanic, gay, or any of the 116 and still metastasizing categories of gender, the only way that you can escape being an oppressor is by becoming a, quote, ally. Allies are something usually associated with war. And indeed, the reigning thinking is that female students and students of color are literally in a war zone on college campuses and need allies from the opposing side to survive. Am I exaggerating? I am not. UC Berkeley's Division of Equity and Inclusion hung banners throughout campus reminding students of the university's paramount mission, assigning guilt and innocence in the ruthlessly competitive totem pole of victimhood. One banner featured a female black student and a Hispanic male student allegedly pleading, "Allow people other than yourself to exist," a message directed to Berkeley's white students and faculty. This is not hyperbole. They mean it literally. College presidents are the worst offenders in encouraging this delusional victimology. After the 3-hour expletive-filled tirade against the Yale sociologist, Yale's president, Peter Salovey, actually thanked the boorish thugs for making him proud of his student body. Yale subsequently conferred a racial justice prize on 2 of the most aggressive participants. The dean of the Harvard Medical School recently removed the portraits of its greatest physician scientists from the entrance hall to the school. You can guess the reason. They were all male, and thus looking on them would make Harvard's wilting medical students feel uncomfortable and unsafe. We can only wish these budding doctors luck in the operating room. Narcissistic identity politics has destroyed the serious pursuit of knowledge throughout the humanities and most of the social sciences. Students are being given a license for ignorance. All they need to be told about a book is the melanin content and gonads of its author, to know whether they can dismiss its contents as thoroughly repugnant and not worth reading. Shakespeare, Milton, Plato, Kant, and Locke have all been variously defenestrated by students who have not the slightest clue about Periclean Athens, the Renaissance, or the Enlightenment. A Columbia undergraduate groused about Columbia's beleaguered core curriculum, quote, "Who is this Mozart, this Haydn, these superior white men? The core, she said, quote, upholds the premises of white supremacy and racism. No professor has ever defended our intellectual patrimony against such shameful outbreaks of ecstatic know-nothingism without adding some puling qualification about respecting diversity. Academic identity politics are now rapidly spreading throughout the culture at large. Every non-academic institution, no matter how previously meritocratic, is now vulnerable. And that means, above all, the STEM fields. Exhibit A in our culture's descent into identity-driven mediocrity and thought control is the firing of computer engineer James Damore from Google in August 2017. Damore had written a carefully reasoned, fact-based memo suggesting that the average career preferences of males and females may explain why there's not a 50-50 gender parity at Google and other tech firms. The language that Google's CEO used in firing Mr. Damore was a direct import from academic victimology. Google's employees were, quote, hurting, he said, because Damore had dared to challenge the reigning feminist orthodoxy. What followed Mr. Damore's firing was even scarier. A regional branch of the National Labor Relations Board upheld Google's actions on the same bathos-drenched victim grounds. Mr. Damore's memo had made Google's employees feel, quote, unsafe at work, according to the NLRB Associate General Counsel. The memo thus constituted, quote, discrimination and sexual harassment. Consider for a moment what this NLRB ruling means for science. Any evolutionary biologist, psychologist, or economist who studies the different risk preferences and appetite for competition among males and females is now at risk of his job. These branches of science could shut down completely, no matter that their findings are true. The thinking that got Mr. Damore fired is now the dominant characteristic of our time. It holds that the absence of exact proportional representation of various racial, ethnic, and sexual groups in any institution is by definition a result of discrimination. To suggest that different groups have different capacities, cultures, skills, and behaviors that explain the lack of proportional representation is not just taboo, it will get you fired. And so the mad rage for gender and racial proportionality in the workplace is accelerating, especially in the Me Too era. From here on out, everything you read, everything you watch in the mainstream media will have been calculated in conformity with the demands of diversity. If you are a white male, no matter how talented, you're going to have to meet a higher standard to get hired or promoted. This summer, California Polytechnic University proudly announced that its crusade to lower the number of whites on campus was succeeding. Every college is, in essence, doing the same thing, if not as publicly. Newsrooms are under enormous pressure to find reporters, select sources, and originate stories that will improve their diversity profile. Book publishers are obsessively engineering their lists to prioritize, quote, diverse authors and themes. Thanks to media pressure and their own human resources departments, corporate boardrooms have made a fetish of gender proportionality. Even before California mandated female board hires, I voted against every female who shows up on a proxy ballot, because I assume that she is there because of her sex, not her business experience. Case in point, Drew Gilpin Faust, the outgoing president of Harvard, recently accepted a position on Goldman Sachs's board. Who knew that left-wing American history professors were experts in investment banking? But university administrators and faculty may hate capitalism, but they love capitalist dollars. Even classical music is being poisoned by identity politics. New Yorker music critic Alex Ross triggered outrage against the Chicago and Philadelphia Symphony Orchestras this spring by tweeting that they had programmed no female composers in their upcoming season. Never mind that at the very moment of Ross's tweet, the Chicago Symphony was performing Jennifer Higdon's Concerto for Low Brass at Carnegie Hall, a work which Chicago and Philadelphia had commissioned, no doubt at grotesquely inflated cost. It is absurd to expect gender parity in the concert hall. The reality is this: the greatest composers of all time, whether Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Chopin, or Brahms, were male. Get over it. And be grateful for the beauty that they gave us, unworthy mortals. But classical music boards are also under enormous pressure to hire by gender and race for conducting positions and everything else. A classical music agent told me wistfully, "If only I had a trans conductor, I'd be rich." Now, it is an unalloyed pleasure that Hollywood is being forced to sacrifice its best box office judgment to meet the demands of the race and gender bean counters. But it is in the sciences where the diversity imperative becomes actually dangerous. Every academic science department, whether physics, math, or chemistry, is in the victimologist's crosshairs. The federal government is demanding that science departments hire based on gender and race rather than scientific merit. Science education is being slowed down and watered down in the hope of graduating more females and underrepresented minorities. An oncologist at an Ivy League medical school was berated by his dean for an exam in pharmacology that was, quote, too fact-based. I don't know about you, but if I'm going for cancer treatment, I would like my doctor to know the facts about drug interactions. The National Science Foundation is spending billions of your taxpayer dollars on programs to boost diversity in science, arguing that only a diverse laboratory can achieve scientific breakthroughs. That's funny because somehow the 200 National Science Foundation grantees who won Nobel Prizes managed to discover dark matter and the genetics of viruses, among other breakthroughs, without conforming to today's diversity metrics. And of course, this mania for gender and race parity in science continues into the private sector. After James Damore was fired, a human resources manager at YouTube and Google sued YouTube for firing him because he had refused to go along with the mandate to interview only females, blacks, and Hispanics for entry-level engineering jobs. Potentially groundbreaking scientists are being passed over today because they are of the wrong race and gender. Guess who does not care about diversity metrics? China. The best thing that Trump could do to level the playing field would be to airlift a few cargo planes of gender theorists from American universities and dump them on Beijing University and China's research labs. Until that happens, China will inexorably pull ahead in science because it cares only about one thing in its science labs: accomplishment. Academic identity politics is tearing our society apart. It is teaching young people to hate the greatest thinkers and creators of the past, and to hate their fellow Americans. The diversity delusion, therefore, must be nipped in the bud. The next time self-engrossed students occupy a campus building demanding more reparations, here is what their college president should say: "Are you kidding me? You are the most privileged individuals in human history. You have at your fingertips the thing that Faust sold his soul for, knowledge. You're surrounded by libraries that would have driven the Renaissance humanists mad with envy and desire. You can read any book that has ever been written. You have access to scientific laboratories that are the most advanced in the world. You can pursue languages, literature, and history. Everything is available. Far from discriminating against minorities and females in hiring, every faculty search here is one long effort at finding remotely qualified, underrepresented minority and female candidates who have not already been snapped up by better endowed schools. Far from discriminating against underrepresented minorities at admissions, we employ double standards in order to engineer so-called diversity. I can assure you that my faculty are not bigots. They have nothing but goodwill for history's oppressed groups and want all their students to succeed. At this very moment, millions of Asian students are studying night and day for the privilege of experiencing this alleged maelstrom of hatred. If you feel so oppressed, step aside and let them take your place. But a college president never says any of these things, of course. Instead, he is silent before these outbreaks of narcissistic delusion, happy to sell out his faculty as alleged racists, and penitently promising to make further amends for so mistreating the oppressed students. It becomes imperative then for the rest of us to rebut the victimology narrative. It is not enough to call for free speech. That is, if I may borrow a term, a relatively safe stance to take. Even some liberals will back you up. No, if we're going to restore sanity and civil harmony, we're going to have to take on the victimology narrative directly and assert that racism and oppression are not the predominant characteristics of American society today. For all our historical sins, and they have been large, there has never been a more tolerant, opportunity-filled polity than our present one. The preservation of freedom requires knowledge of how unique has been the West's development of the rule of law, the scientific method, and the concept of individual rights. Passing on that knowledge was once one of the university's noblest callings. But a university's highest calling is to convey the full glory of Western inheritance, to inspire students to get down on their knees in gratitude instead of raising their fists in protest, to grasp the beauty, wit, and profundity of a vast and rich tradition, one to be discovered, if you will permit me a highly selective and somewhat personal list, in the work of Aeschylus, Rabelais, Tiepolo, Twain, and despite the risk of student complaint, Mozart. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thanks. We have time for some questions. Just wait for the microphone to arrive, and please ask a question rather than making any kind of long-winded statement. So we'll start at the back.
Thanks for that talk, Heather. I'm looking forward to reading your book. What would be some on your short list of actions that people can take as a practical matter? What do you think of Heterodox Academy, Jonathan Haidt's initiative? On a related matter, there are a lot of people I know who are not even conservative or free market who want to say I'm withholding money from the university as an alumni. But what do you think of those actions, or what other actions do you think you could suggest as a practical matter to lean against this trend?
Well, certainly. Please do not send another dollar to your alma mater unless you have done extensive due diligence. You would not invest in a company, I presume, without such examination. You should not keep funneling money into this beast. Even you know, they still have the STEM fields going for them, and a lot of people want to, understandably, support scientific research. But again, two problems with that. A, science is being colonized, and B, money is fungible. Unless you can give it to, you know, something that is specifically dedicated to a non-politicized, non-identity obsessed study of the past and passing on knowledge, don't give. You know, that we are making these institutions invulnerable to criticism. Certainly I support Heterodox Academy. This is an extraordinarily important venture by Jonathan Haidt at NYU to try and hold the Academy's feet to the fire for its extreme lack of intellectual diversity. I'll be honest, though, however, you know, this has been a tactic of both principal liberals and conservatives for a very long time to dig into the voter registration of the faculty and notice an ever-growing divide and imbalance between Democrat-registered and Republican-registered faculty. And it certainly matters, I suppose, for sociology departments. But in theory, my view of the Academy is that it really should be an ivory tower. And it wouldn't really matter if everybody in a university were Democratic if they kept their politics out of the classroom and again, understood that their obligation is passing on this inheritance with gratitude and love. So, but Heterodox Academy is hitting hard on the fact that there is no ideological balance on campus, and it's certainly worth pointing out. As far as what else to do, all I can say is, again, the core problem in all of this is this unchallengeable idea that this society is fundamentally still oppressive, and that oppression explains our world today. If you have any opportunity to hit back against that, we have to take it on, because as long as that remains the dominant narrative, the demands to shut down speech on campus will be insurmountable, because they have a logic, because they're at risk of their lives. Hate speech is literally a threat to their very existence, and therefore must be shut down, because they are surrounded by such a tsunami of hatred. It's that which we need to beat back.
Let's go to the middle over here.
Yes. Do you foresee the anti-meritocratic practices that you describe eventually eroding the status and brand value of the institutions like universities and corporations that practice them, or do you see them floating above it and not being affected by it?
Well, status, of course, these days, the people who hand out status awards are themselves the perpetrators of the diversity ideology. So in status, as long as that remains the key of the New York Times, I mean, it's an evergreen topic. And anytime a reporter is saying, gee, what can I write about? All you got to do is like count the number of females in a business, and that'll get you front page coverage. But I think it is a risk to the actual core competencies of institutions, because gender is simply an irrelevant category. If a scientific lab is all female, great, if they have been chosen by merit. But if instead they've been chosen because the National Science Foundation has been conducting research in intersectionality in engineering and math, if any of you are so lucky to have been protected from the intersectionality phrase, I wish I could share your place. Intersectionality is the latest coinage du jour in academic victim politics to express the multiple disabilities experienced by people who can check off numerous categories of the official victim categories. The NSF is actually paying gender theorists to study intersectionality in the sciences. I mean, this is so mind-blowing. This was an institution founded by Congress in 1950 to advance science basic research, and we're doing intersectionality. So I think this is very much not to be ignored. We are definitely, again, science education is being slowed down in order to try and not leave people out. Pedagogy is changing. There was an announcement this summer by University of Akron computer science professor that he was arbitrarily raising the grades of all his female students as part of his contribution to gender equity in the sciences, in the hope that better grades would encourage them to go along. Now, there was an outcry on the conservative media that got him to back off of this, but believe me, such initiatives are going on sub rosa. So, yes, I think this is very, very threatening.
We'll move to the middle and then over to here. One more in the middle? Yes. Just wait for the microphone, please. Yes, you.
I seem to recall that recently the president at the University of Chicago came out and made some statement that addressed this issue. Something to the effect of, if you don't feel safe here, maybe you should go to another college, because here we respect all voices and want to hear all sides of an issue. Are there other universities or colleges like Chicago that we should be supporting? Is there something positive we can do?
And the Chicago administrators, the dean, the provost, did come out with a very salutary and admirable letter to the freshman class saying, again, right, safety is not our goal here, intellectual debate is. However, I have to say there's an article that's been published recently that draws into question even the University of Chicago's support for pure scientific research. Somebody had published an article that explored from a mathematical perspective one of the theories that got Larry Summers ultimately fired from the Harvard University for explaining why there is not 50-50 gender proportionality in the hard sciences. And Summers put forward the idea that at the extremes of the curve of math stupidity and cluelessness and math brilliance, males dominate. So if you want to find the people who can't even get their primary arithmetic tables down, it's going to be males. But if you want to get the people who are the most brilliant investigators and the most abstract theoretical minds, that's going to be males. In the United States, for example, if you look at the 0.01% of mathematical ability, males outnumber females 2.5 to 1. So there was a paper that was done by somebody recently to try and figure out from an evolutionary basis why there should be these different distributions of mathematical ability. And it was accepted by premier mathematical journals, but the feminists got wind of it. And not just any old feminists, but feminist mathematicians who, again, said that scientific research was dangerous. It was threatening. And the leader of this crusade to get this paper, it was rejected, and then ultimately it was actually disappeared. It had gone online, and it was disappeared. So the author is at a bind right now because he can't publish it elsewhere because he doesn't have the copyright. It was there, and now it's gone. So he's in a limbo. But the main crusader against this paper, heaven forbid anybody read a different take on gender equity in the math, is a female Chicago mathematician at University of Chicago. And there was an appeal made to Robert Zimmer, the president of Chicago, and he didn't respond directly. The vice provost did and said, well, we don't find any intellectual fraud. It was not a fraud claim that was made. So, you know, it's very hard to find a place that is not somehow caving a little. Obviously, St. John's colleges that are committed to the Western canon are admirable, admirable institutions. And there's always Hillsdale that takes no federal money and therefore is impervious to the federal demands for checking off all the various boxes. But it's tough. It's really tough. I mean, I think the next step is going to have to be homeschooling for college or getting a tutor, you know, like we used to have with the Grand Tour. You know, you find some white male classics PhD who can't get hired because he's not doing lesbian vase paintings, and have him take your child around to Rome and the rest of the Roman Empire, and believe me, he'd learn a lot more than he would in most colleges today.
Okay, right over here.
Yes, I'm Michael Myers, president of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. Let's go beyond the crybaby syndrome. Let's address the real problems, the problems of what my mentor, Kenneth Clark, called the failure of the human intellect. Let's assume that our institutions of higher education are not perfect, that there are indicia of past racism, discrimination, exclusion. Kenneth Clark felt that an institution can be inclusionary without double standards. You can hire people who have not been hired before because of race or sex without double standards. So I wonder if you will move beyond the protest analysis and see this as the best and the brightest of the faculty, as that they assume they are. They assume themselves to be. The best and brightest of the administrators, the best and brightest of the trustees of the best and brightest institutions of the nation. Is this not a failure of the human intellect to do justice by cracking up and tearing down these prejudices and passions of prejudices and stereotypes that these people continue to do? Because they make the decisions, not the students. The faculty make the decisions. The administrators make the decisions. And they are the best and the brightest.
Well, Michael, I completely agree that if we have examples of actual discrimination going on, those must be eradicated completely. And I have asked many university administrators and many proponents of the theory of implicit bias, which has been leveled against corporations and universities, can you provide me one example of a competitively qualified female faculty candidate or a corporate employee or underrepresented minority who has not been hired or promoted or maybe even has been overlooked in a faculty search because of gender and race? And I have never gotten an answer. They inevitably duck it. There is no question that this country lived for centuries in the most grotesque violation of its fundamental principles without a seeming awareness of the hypocrisy. And it took us decades and decades to get over that. And it is understandable to be skeptical that we really have. But all I can tell you is that you can go to every faculty search today, and far from discriminating against females or underrepresented minorities, that's all they talk about is who is out there. The problem is in the pipeline. In 2016, there were 16 PhDs in computer science graduating in the entire country who were black. That's 0.1% of the total. It's absurd to think with that paucity of available candidates that every computer science department is going to show race parity, and the same is true for females. As for beating back stereotypes, I would submit that there is nothing more dangerous in the perpetuation of stereotypes than racial preferences. Racial preferences are offered to students in order to diversify the student body, bringing in students who are often one standard deviation or two below the norm in that particular college. Now, nobody is saying that minority students should not go to college. Of course they should. But everybody should go to a college for which they are qualified. Let's take it outside of race and put it in the category of gender. MIT, sadly, is itself obsessed with gender. So let's say they admit me as a freshman to fill their gender quota. And let's say I have math SATs of 650. But all my peers have 800s, which is the top on their math SATs. What's going to happen to me my freshman year? I'm going to flounder in advanced calculus, my other classes. I would have done perfectly well if I'd gone to Boston College, which is a perfectly respectable college. But having been catapulted into an environment for which I'm less qualified, I'm going to struggle, and I may end up switching majors, if not leaving completely. And we see this happening with minorities as well in the sciences. When you admit people who end up, because of these perverse racial preferences, and they end up clustered at the bottom of the class, which also happens at law school, something that Amy Wax from UPenn, who's here today, has fought over, that does not help ease stereotypes. And they are the result of an affirmative decision on the part of universities, and they're not necessary. It's not necessary to perpetuate these stereotypes. It's the fact of preferences that do it.
Time for a few more questions. Let's go to the back of the room. We haven't gone back there, so.
Yeah. Heather Brown is now in the midst of another controversy about suppressing this paper on gender dysphoria, right, which was something I hadn't even heard of till I read about the controversy. Lucky but it leads to my larger question, and that is, are there any organizations of scientists, whether social scientists or hard scientists or whatever, who are worried enough about this trend that they're willing to speak up about it because of what they see happening to research in their disciplines?
You would think, wouldn't you? I don't know of one. Last summer, the American Association of Science, their conference had panels galore on LGBTQ discrimination in the sciences, on gender discrimination. Very few scientists are willing to buck this. UCLA now has a requirement that every incoming faculty applicant has to fill out a form or write a statement about his contributions to equity, diversity, and inclusion, meaning does his research understand the problems of underrepresented minorities. It's not clear to me that Albert Einstein could get hired at UCLA today under the current regime. UCLA would rather prioritize a professor's diversity contributions than basic science. We can hope that there's going to be splinter groups that will set out, but my experience talking to my friends that are, say, engineers, I would say about half an engineering department believes that the gender mandate that is forced upon them at every faculty search is reckless and is putting their competitive edge at risk. But astoundingly, the other half actually believe in it. Because, I would ask you, generous philanthropists, I support what you do, but inevitably the measure for any of the open-hearted American philanthropists for their uplift programs is how many students are going to college. Not necessarily a good idea, because it turns out that the more education somebody has, for females say, the more likely they are to think of themselves as oppressed. And so the engineers who are in these departments now are themselves the product of the Diversity Academy. And so we're going to reach a tipping point when it's going to be very hard to break out of this.
We have time for just one more question. I'll go to the front table here.
So I wonder how you would answer this apparent paradox in the private elite university area. The alumni bodies are giving more and more and more money. They also are electing the trustees, and the trustees elect and appoint the president.
Yeah.
And given that system, we seem to have a behavior in those institutions that is directly attacking the people, that is the huge body of alumni who support the university. It strikes me as a paradox.
Yeah, well, it's the same paradox that one of the Henry Fords pointed out with his own foundation attacking the system that made it possible. And it's the privilege of wealth. It's the privilege granted these universities by generous alumni that it's an admirable instinct, the American instinct to give. It's unique in the world, really. But please, you've got to start doing your due diligence. And of course, it also helps, don't just stop giving money, tell them that you are. But I don't know, we've got to support the non-politicized study of greatness, because that's what a university is there for. And if you have any clout with your university, look at the course catalog, see, are they teaching constitutional history? This is something that's an endangered species now in history departments. Does the English major require Shakespeare and Milton? Probably not. Probably it's all, subaltern writers. So, we can't give up. It's not worth giving up because this tradition is too important. We are in the debt of these thinkers who went before us for giving us beauty and greatness, and you just have to fight it as hard as you can and as long as you can.
Well, that's a good note to end on. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you very much.
The book is The Diversity Delusion. It's just out from St. Martin's Press. Thank you.